So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a few tiny bits of clay, putting them down on my wheel, and I'm using the clay like glue to hook down my bat. So this is a bat. There's different types of bats that can be used. Pushing it down. I usually put a towel over my leg like that. I'm going to go ahead and start with the pound and a half. This is where, if you didn't pre-wedge your clay, you would want to wedge it, and you can use your wheel head to do that. I have already wedged my clay. It's ready to go. So this is why it's called throwing on the potter's wheel, because you actually throw the clay down. You want to try to get it in the middle of the wheel, because if you get it off center, then it's more difficult to get centered when the wheel is running. You use the foot pedal on the wheel just like the accelerator pedal on a car. I have it here on my right side because that's my dominant foot and the one I'm most used to. I've actually dunked my hands in water. I need to get my hands wet, and I have my elbows in towards my body, like a 90-degree angle in towards my body, and I have them down. I'm kind of hunched down, rested on my legs, and I have my elbows in towards my hips. I'm also really scooted up next to the wheel. That way I have a good strong center. So I'm going to put my hands on the clay like this, and then I'm going to be pushing down, trying to center the clay. So we're trying to put all our body weight in on that clay to center it. You never want to put your hands on the clay when the wheel is stopped, because you'll throw it out of center, because our goal is to try to keep it symmetrical while it's on the wheel and while we're throwing it. So if it gets off center in any way, it makes one side of the piece uneven, one side thin and one side thick, and that's not what we want. We want nice, even wheel thrown pottery. So I'm going to go ahead and wet my hands again. Again, I'm at a 90-degree angle. My hands are down, and I actually want to center my clay at a very fast speed. So I'm pushing down on my clay, pushing down on it, and I'm pushing in on it. So I want to show you here what happens if your clay is not centered. It's wobbly. If you get too much slip on your hands, that's what I have that bucket there to capture that stuff. If your bat gets too messy and you don't like that on your hands, just use your sponge. Pushing down, trying to get this even. Okay, it looks like it's centered. So I've got a nice centered piece of clay. And what I can do is clean out the edge. The next step is to open your centered piece of clay. We're going to open it by putting our thumbs down in it or the sponge. You want to stay centered though. It's real easy to open it. We want to keep it centered. So if you're beginning, if you're a beginner potter and you haven't done this much before, it is best to use both hands on the centered piece and push your thumbs down in the middle. The bigger the piece, the more you have to push. You can slow your wheel down if it helps. You can slow your wheel down. And we're just using our thumbs to drill down through the bottom. So we don't want to drill all the way down. We want to get to where there is about 1/4 of an inch of clay at the bottom. You can do a larger amount of clay than that, but I've been doing this for a long time, and I actually like to open my pieces using my sponge, so I don't stab it with my fingernails. So I use my sponge, and I will center myself on top of it, and I'll just use my sponge like a drill. And while I'm drilling down, I'm also kind of pulling out on the clay and pushing down on the top. So I've kind of worked it a little bit out of center. It's kind of wobbly, but I can fix that real easy at this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop. And what I'm gonna do is actually coat my needle tool with clay, some of the slip on my fingers. And I'm gonna use this needle tool to go down, and I'm gonna put my finger to the bottom of the thing to see how deep the bottom of this piece is. So it is about 1/4 of an inch. Sometimes you have to check a few times to see how deep it is. We want it to be about 1/4 of an inch, not any thinner than that, because when we cut this piece off the bat, there needs to be a little clay there because some of it will be left on the plastic bat. Step number 1 is to wedge your clay. Step 2, to center. Step 3, drill down and make an opening. Step 4 is to widen it if you want. I'm going to be making a cylinder today. So we're going to widen it, then we're going to pull the edges up, then we'll finish the shape and we'll cut it off the bat. So now what I'm doing is using my sponge and my fingers to bring the opening of the clay out. I'm opening it wider and I'm making the base of my vessel. Then I'm going to smooth it out, and then our next step is to start bringing up the walls of our piece. Don't want to get your hands too wet or too dry. So now I'm evening out the clay shape, compressing down on the top of it so it doesn't get too misshapen or too soft at the top. And then I'm going to slow my wheel down a little and start pulling up the sides of the piece a tiny bit at a time. Compress it again. I'm getting the slip off my hands, using my sponge to clean out the shape. When you put your sponge or your fingers on the pot, you want to make sure that the wheel has one full rotation as you move your hands up the clay body or vessel so that is even, and the clay ring that you're moving up from the bottom moves all the way to the top of the piece. So what I'm doing here is I'm working on trying to get that thick clay towards the bottom of the pot and pull it up towards the top edge, which is also making the pot taller at the same time. This is kind of a slow process, or you should take your time so you get nice even walls while keeping the pot in center. So as you can see here, my pot or vessel has become a little off center, and that's because I'm pulling and moving so much clay at once, and I can take my time and smooth that back out. I have definitely slowed my wheel down here from the speed I had when I centered the piece. It's also important that you take the time to compress the rim or the top of the piece, because it will end up being very soft and have lots of slip on it. So I'm using my sponge and my finger to kind of do that and compress it. It's a little wobbly, so I can use my needle tool and even it out, or I can keep pressing the clay to get the top of the pot to look like I want it to. So I have a little more clay to move up from the bottom of the pot to the top, and then finally I work on the top of the piece to get the rim nice and smooth. Then I can work on shaping the vessel. I have a whole bunch of different types of clay ribs of different shapes that I use to help me shape my pots. But the best tool is honestly using your fingers and your hands and your knuckles and that sponge, because you can get all sorts of shapes. It's best to use these until you get used to using tools. Before putting a tool on your piece, it's important to get it wet and dunk it in water first, because if you just try to use the tool dry, it will kind of stick to the piece and cause more damage than good. So I'm continuing to smooth the edges. So now I'm using my chamois. It's a tiny piece of a cowhide chamois, so I can use it to smooth out the rim. Since this is going to be a coffee cup, it's really important the rim is nice and even and smooth so it doesn't cut anyone in the mouth. So now I'm searching through trying to find the rib that I want to use today. I have lots of different sizes of ribs that have many different uses on different sizes of pots. So I'm going to use this tiny one. It's a wooden rib to help me shape the sides and smooth out the inside of the piece. The ribs are what help get nice S-shaped curves in pottery. Some potters also make their own ribs out of wood or plastic. So now I'm using both of my hands on the neck of the piece to kind of bring it in a little bit. It got too wide, so I'm bringing it in to get that nice S-shaped curve. Then I need to use my chamois again to smooth that top edge. I just keep going back and forth and smoothing and shaping. Now I'm pushing from the outside and the inside of the piece at the same time. And I'm adding some throwing rings on the piece. So this is a trimming tool I really love. I use it to kind of remove clay at the bottom of pieces so I don't have to work so hard when I'm trimming the feet. And it has a really sharp edge and it works kind of like a lathe. And I just hold it against there and it takes off a tiny bit of clay. So now I'm going to dry my hands off so I can use my wire cutting tool to very carefully cut my piece off the bat. This is really important you get that wire nice and stretched tight, then pull it across the bottom of the pot. I'm using my handy paint scraper to pry my bat off the wheel, and I have a finished piece. Thanks for watching!